Today's top CEOs from companies like McDonald's, Apple, and Home Depot are revealing some incredible insider information as to what they see happening in the economy right now. Are they predicting that we're going to head into a recession, an economic depression, or are they predicting we are heading into the next cycle of the economic boom? I'm going to reveal this to you right now in one simple, fast step. Step number one, let's go over two different stories for the U.S. economy. In fact, before we get into what these CEOs are saying, let's start by looking at a couple charts that are very, very important. First, we go all the way back to 2010 to today's, actually, not quite to today's date, back in the middle of 2023. On the left, we go from 0% up to 15%. This blue line represents the CPI as it was measured in 1980. In other words, today's CPI, today's consumer price inflation, if it was measured the same way the government themselves measured it back in 1980. This red line represents the headline CPI that we have today. We'll call it the CPI. Big shout out to my good buddy Jason Burrick, who came up with that perfect way to describe the CPI. Okay, so we go all the way back to 2010, and first of all, notice the discrepancy between the headline number that we have based on today's methodology versus the methodology they used back in 1980. It goes up and down a bit, but pretty much flat lines until we get to the cerveza sickness. And you guys know what happened in 2021 and 2022. The CPI inflation skyrocketed. Now, check this out. The headline number got up to about 9.1. I think it was in June of 2022. But if we would have used the same government methodology they used in 1980, it would have peaked out at over 15%. And it is true, we have had disinflation, meaning the rate of consumer price inflation has declined. And keep in mind, that's not deflation. People confuse that with prices actually going down. But the rate of increase has declined, but it's only gone down to about 3.4%. But that's based on the way they calculate the numbers today. If we go back to the way they used to do it, headline CPI inflation right now, as we speak, would have gone down, but it would still be at over 10%. Whoa, time out. I know right about now your friend and family member Fred, who absolutely loves the government, the politicians, the BLS, and all the government statistics. They say, wow, George, you can't go back and look at this blue line as though it somehow pertains to what the economy is doing right now, because the methodology has changed for the better. They've made improvements. Don't you know that the politicians and central planners have our best interest as their number one priority? So the fact that they've made improvements just means that it's a more accurate number today than it otherwise would have been. That's a fair argument. But for your friend and family member Fred, I would suggest going back maybe a little bit further to the 1970s. And if it is true that the way we calculate the numbers today is far more accurate, then if we'd use today's numbers back in the 1970s, then we wouldn't have had inflation at all. So if you want to argue that the way we calculate the numbers today is superior and more accurate, then you would also have to argue that we didn't have consumer price inflation in the 1970s. Do you really want to make that argument? I didn't think so. All right, let's get back to the video. And our second chart goes to 2020 all the way to today's date. On the left, we go from 0% up to 14%. This green line represents the nominal wage increases for a specific age group. Young people, 16 to 24. Red line represents nominal wage increases for 25 to 54-year-olds. Now look at this discrepancy. This is incredible. So even at the peak of the wage gains, let's say in 2022 and 2023, year over year, the 25 to 54-year-olds, the people who actually have families to provide for, their wages were going up by, let's just say, 7%. And you say, well, George, that's amazing. Right, but let's go back and look at the real rate of inflation during that time frame. And the real rate of inflation was probably around 15%. So if the prices of the stuff you buy daily is going up by 15%, when the government says it's going up by 9%, and your wages are only going up by 7%, as we used to say when I was a kid, that dog don't hunt, meaning that your purchasing power is declining even though your wages are going up. And at the end of the day, the only thing that matters is how much stuff you can buy every single month with your paycheck. And before we move on, I'd like to point out that young people's incomes didn't go up by a measly 7%. Absolutely not. In fact, they went up by almost 15%. So at the very least, they were keeping up with the rate of inflation, and possibly their wages were exceeding inflation, meaning they were doing the opposite of the 25 to 50-year-olds from the standpoint of their purchasing power was going up instead of down. Now that we understand the dynamics that have played out and how this has impacted the average American, let's go straight over to the internet and check out what these top CEOs are saying about the US economy today, and then we'll try to make some predictions as to whether we think the probabilities are highest that this means we're going into a recession or an economic depression, or that we're going right back into the next economic boom.
The title of the CNBC article is Are Consumers Pulling Back on Spending? It depends on which CEO you ask. The key talking points here. The latest round of earnings report shows some companies struggling as consumers grow more selective with their spending. They blame this on higher prices, just like the stuff we were talking about on the whiteboard. Companies like Pepsi have warned about low income consumers, while Delta and Chipotle have benefited from higher income customer bases. Yeah, I don't think so. I see it a different way. More on that in just a moment. But there are a lot more CEOs that gave some incredible insights, such as McDonald's, Starbucks, Home Depot, were saying that customers in their stores were definitely pulling back spending to a significant degree. Now, we talked about Delta Airlines earlier. I find it interesting that United said the same thing about what they're seeing with air traffic or travel, that it's actually increasing. This CNBC article summarizes by saying, with higher prices and elevated interest rates stubbornly sticking around, Chipotle burritos and European vacations are still on the table for many consumers, but Big Macs and kitchen remodels are not. They also point out that Apple saw iPhone sales fall by 10%, and this suggests consumers weren't upgrading to the latest version of smartphones. And this makes a lot of sense when you consider another key talking point that they discussed in this article, that many consumers are having to put rent, groceries, and gas on a credit card. And we can see this really playing out in the data. The average consumer now owes $6,218 on their credit card, up 8.5% year over year. And keep in mind, they're probably paying 20+% to hold that balance. Big box giant Walmart said last Thursday that shoppers are prioritizing buying food and health related items over general merchandise like home goods and electronics. Yeah, but that's not the whole story. I read what they said, and they're actually talking about how they are seeing a boom with high end consumers, basically rich people buying their groceries at Walmart. And they interpret this as the high end consumer is getting squeezed just like the low end consumers. So instead of shopping at places like Whole Foods, they're now having to shop at places like Walmart to make their paycheck go further, even though they're earning $150,000, $200,000 a year. And we talked about Pepsi earlier. Their CEO specifically said the lower income consumer in the US is stretched and is strategizing a lot to make their budgets get to the end of the month. So, based on what these CEOs have been saying, you would assume that, okay, yeah, the probability is probably high that we're headed into a recession, maybe something even worse. But then there are other CEOs that see their business booming, such as Delta, United, and Chipotle. We were talking about that earlier. Now, they were saying that they believe that this is because the high end consumer is doing great. Really? If the high-end consumer is doing great, why are they having to buy all their groceries at Walmart? No, no, no. The devil's in the details. So let's look at what Delta and United said specifically. They see that their flights are all full, but they're also selling more premium first class tickets. And then Chipotle, who saw their same store sales grow by 7% during the first quarter, fueled by a 5.4% increase in foot traffic. They said that this is probably because their brand has a very strong perception of value among diners. So now we can start putting the pieces of the puzzle together. And I think I've got a very good idea as to what is really happening in the US economy right now as we speak, and if the probability is high that we are headed into a recession. But to explain this further, editor, let's go right back to the whiteboard.
What we know so far is the real rate of consumer price inflation was likely much higher than the government actually reported, and that the wages for the young people went up a lot more than the wages for the age group 25 to 54. Therefore, their purchasing power might have actually increased, where for most people that have families or middle class, let's say, middle class America, their purchasing power declined significantly. But I forgot one group that's very, very important. You see, there are some Americans that own assets, and there are some Americans that don't. So if you have a 401k, if you have a house in a nice neighborhood, your net worth most likely doubled, if not tripled. So at least on paper, your purchasing power has increased dramatically, which would incentivize you to go out there and, hey, I'm going to go out to dinner. I'm going to travel first class. Why not? I deserve it. My stock portfolio has tripled over the last 3 years. I can afford to have these luxuries that I otherwise wouldn't have spent on. And then let's think through how the generations differ as far as boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z. There is no disputing that Gen Z favors experiences far more than they favor stuff. So is it any surprise that if they're just flushed with purchasing power, that they're going to travel to Thailand, to Costa Rica, to Tulum, so they can hang out with all their other Instagram wannabe influencer buddies and post to social media as how fantastic of a time they're having doing cliff diving and kayaking and overlanding and all the other cool things that you can post so your friends can think that you have this amazing life when in reality, it's only a little snapshot and 99% of it is you driving Uber or working at Starbucks. So this would completely explain why companies like Delta and United are seeing their business boom. So what about Chipotle? Well, this is just some anecdotal evidence that I'll throw out there. But I actually love Chipotle, and I go there whenever I'm in the United States. And you're always in line, as most of you know. But next time you go to Chipotle, look around. Is it just super, super rich people everywhere? Not really. But it is young people. I would say 80% of the people that I see in Chipotle are under 35 years old. So again, looking at it through the lens of this chart, their incomes went up dramatically. It makes a lot of sense. Where if you look at the economy through the lens of the average American, let's say 35, 40-year-old that has 2 kids, You have to pay for the roof over your head. You've got to pay for food. You can't afford to go out to Chipotle. You are in this group, especially if you don't have assets, where your purchasing power has declined massively. And therefore, you're not going to Home Depot for that kitchen remodel. You're not buying the iPhone. You're not even taking your kids out to McDonald's anymore. A very simple visual that I like to use is just basically separating people into three groups. We've got the young people, the people in the middle here, the 25 to 54-year-olds without assets, and then Americans with assets. So these black lines represent their purchasing power in 2019. Not that they all had the same purchasing power, but that's our starting point for each group. And like we've been saying, for the young people, based on this red line, their purchasing power went way up. The people of assets, way up. Where the people that are right here in the middle, their purchasing power went way down. So, and this is really the key. It's the story, the two different stories of the US economy. So if we want to predict what's likely to happen in the future as far as the overall economy going into recession, depression, or into the next economic boom, we have to ask ourselves what's likely going to happen to the purchasing power for all of these groups that are involved. Well, for me, this starts by analyzing the CPI. To begin with, let me explain what I am referring to. You see, if the price of the stuff you have to have goes up, such as rent, gas, food, then you have to pull back from spending on the stuff that you want, assuming your wages aren't going up to keep pace with the rate of inflation. Therefore, your purchasing power is declining. So it's all about the stuff you need versus the stuff you want. Now, the stuff you want, there's a lot of businesses that cater to those types of items. So since they see less spending, they've got to tighten their belts. And at a certain point, they have to start firing employees. And this is a lot of retail workers. So what happens is the unemployment rate really starts to go up with the businesses that are providing goods and services for the things that people want versus what they need. And that's going to directly impact the young workers. And we can see that playing out right here in the data, that their wage increases have been declining significantly. And then you have to ask, well, what's going to happen to asset prices? Well, there are no certainties, there are only probabilities, but I would assume that asset prices will come down after the unemployment rate starts to go up. Okay, so let's think this through. Right now, we've got spending represented by these red lines, or purchasing power, let's say. So if the unemployment rate goes up with the stuff that we want based on consumer price inflation, then I would bet the purchasing power here for the young people will go down, let's just say to the level of the 25 to 54-year-olds without any assets. And unfortunately, their jobs might also be impacted, so their purchasing power will go down even further. So even if assets remain high, when you take this spending in aggregate total, it's a lot less than we're seeing right now. And since the consumer is 70% of the economy, this would make my base case point in the direction of recession. And let's remember that right now, in the stock market at least, bad news is good news. So the more unemployment we have, the more that means the Fed's going to drop rates, and therefore the NASDAQ and the S&P continue to go higher and higher and higher. But at a certain point, all of this decline in spending that we've been referring to makes the market realize that, wait a minute, bad news is actually bad news. That's when the asset prices decline and the purchasing power of the people with assets also comes down. So when those asset prices come down, that's when I think we could go from a recession into something potentially even worse. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.